Hello everyone, this video is going to be regarding the latest numbers of Q2, the quarter 2 of 2024-25. There has been a significant drop in the GDP numbers, so that's what the news is all about. The main culprits are manufacturing and mining and quarrying. There has been a significant drop in these numbers, the manufacturing and the mining sector. So what is this all about? When we look at the overview of the GDP growth slump, what we see is that India's real GDP growth rate has dropped down to 5.4% in the July-September quarter of 2024-25, that is this year. Usually the fiscal year starts from the April of every year and ends in the March of next year. So when we say 2024, July-September 2024, we are talking about the year started from April 2024 and ends in March 2025. So whatever number we are seeing here, this is the lowest number, lowest growth rate we are seeing in the last 7 quarters. The growth rate, when we compare it to two particular contexts, we have to see this growth rate in two contexts. One is the context of the previous quarter of this year itself, this fiscal itself, that is the April, May and June quarter, compare it to the present one, July, August, September. So when we look at that, look at this, it was 6.7 and it has dropped to 5.4. And similarly, if we compare it to the previous year's same quarter, so that is July, August, September of previous year, we were at 8.1% growth rate. From there, the drop has been, clearly visible. So from both the contexts, we see the drop. So the factors which have led to this drop are mostly the sectors, the two sectors. One is the manufacturing sector and the other one is the contraction in the mining and the quarrying sector. In fact, what we see is later on in the graphs I will show you, the mining and the quarrying sector have seen a negative growth. We call it as contraction. Whereas the manufacturing sector, though in the positive, not much positive, right? Compared to the previous quarter or the previous year's same quarter, manufacturing sector has not done so well. So this is how the quarterly performance of the GDP, real GDP growth rate has been over the years, starting from the Q1 of FY 2022. We see that it was 22.6%. You might be wondering why is this so high and 5.4% it's not so good. But you are supposed to look at this 5.4% from this context. This is how a stable economy grows. Sir, why do we have this high number here? So this was mostly due to what we call as the base effect. It's just that in the previous year, that is we are talking about the COVID year, the growth rates were very low. And when the economy sprung back to normal, we see that it looks like a very huge shift. That is why we see this high number. We are not supposed to consider this number. So this is how a stable economy, that is an emerging economy like India, will be growing 7 to 8% range. So even by those standards, 5.4% is low, is what I would like to say. So when we do the sectoral analysis, we see manufacturing sector and we see the mining and quarrying sector mostly. And we have other sectors as well. We have the agriculture sector. So services sector, we are going to look at that later, construction sector. So when we look at the manufacturing sector, as I told you, it is in the positive. It grew by 2.2% in this quarter. But that is something which is less than 7% that we saw in the previous quarter, Q1 of 24-25. In fact, when you look at the previous year, same quarter, it was 14.3%. So usually the manufacturing sector has to be performing above 6%, 7%. But we see that the performance is in the positive but just 2.2%. So this has contributed to the slump. And when you come to the mining and quarrying, look at this, it is just 0.1%. That is not even the positive, it is contraction, it is negative, right? And look at this, it has dropped from 7.2% growth in the last quarter, that is Q1, and it was 11.1% in the same quarter last year. So by these standards, it is really bad. So we can only expect the GDP numbers to fall when the numbers are like this. So the same has been represented on the graph here. So these are the numbers of this quarter for manufacturing and your mining, quarrying. So drop from here, and you see a drop compared to this as well. So this is last year's numbers, same quarter, this year's number, but the previous quarter. So any comparison you see, so we talk about 5.4% growth rate now. This is in comparison to the Q2 of last year, right? Last year if it was 100, this year it is 105.4. So generally it had to be 108. So at least 7-8% growth was required. So what we see is just 5.4% growth. Next, so what are the factors that contributed to this drop? We say that it is manufacturing and your mining and quarrying are the culprits. Why are they the culprits? So when it comes to manufacturing, it is mostly due to the excess capacity and the import dumping. When you get a lot of imports from abroad, especially from countries like China, it becomes difficult for the manufacturing units here to produce at a prices which are being provided by the Chinese counterparts. They provide the goods and services, especially the goods, at a very low price. So it becomes very difficult for the Indian manufacturers or the domestic manufacturers to produce and sell at the same price. So when there is too much imports at very low prices, it becomes problematic, to run the businesses or to produce more. So when you are not producing more at competitive price, you end up having the capacity to manufacture, but you are not manufacturing. So idle capacity. And then the problem in the mining and quarrying sector was about the extended rainfall. So whenever there is excess rainfall for months together, you generally find it difficult to do the mining and quarrying work. So the workers find it difficult to get into the mines, right, to do the quarrying. There were also challenges in the hiring and the compensation policies, especially in the private sector, in the corporate sector. So this was another problem. Now GDP growth projections is another thing. So in the context of what is happening now, almost all the institutions we talk about, the institution which produces the number, which gives us the number, GDP, GVA numbers, is National Statistics Office. GDP growth projections are made by mostly the economic institution. One is your finance ministry also has some expectations. So it comes in the form of economic survey, right? So the chief economic advisor pens the economic survey every year. According to this, it is 6.5 to 7%, right, for this year. This is the projection. And when it comes to Reserve Bank of India, it is on the positive side, right? It pegs the number on a higher side at 7.2%. For the next year, it says, a tad bit on the lower side. It is going to be 7.1%. What we can see is that with 5.4% in this quarter, can the next quarter and the upcoming quarter Q3 and Q4 numbers, can they bounce back and probably reach 7% is the question. Why? Because there is a lot of room to cover now. What most of the experts are saying is that while it is a significant drop to 5.4%, when we look at the overall Q1 and what we can see in the future, probably with the RBI taking some measures like the interest rate cut, if it cuts the repo rate, credit uptake will increase. When the credit uptake increases, the manufacturing activity will resume and it is going to thrive. So probably the problems are going to get solved. And with this outlook, even with 5.4% growth in this quarter, we can expect that there is not going to be a significant downside risk. What is a downside risk? this number going down significantly, the projection number. That is not going to happen. So it's not going to be like 6% or even 5.5%. That's not going to happen. Why? Because we had a strong Q1. So expectations are that Q3 and Q4 are going to do well. So we can expect somewhere around 6.8, 6.7% growth rate at least. So we need not worry about it dropping below 6% or even below 6.5%. Whatever change we are going to see is going to be in 0.1, 0.2%. That's it. Okay, it's going to, we can peg the number between 6.8 and 7.2, right, for this fiscal 24-25. Now, coming to the sectoral performance, as I had mentioned earlier, these two are the culprits that we know. The other three sectors, when you look at it, they have performed really well. In fact, these are the ones which have made a compensation and ensured that we are at least sticking at 5.4%. Look at this, agriculture grew at 3.5%. See, though the Indian economy is largely, driven by agriculture, most of the people are employed in agriculture, but the maximum contribution is by services sector. But what we see is that 3.5% is good. You might be wondering, this is not good enough. Just imagine 4% is considered to be outstanding performance for agriculture. 3.5 is good enough now. Compare it to the previous quarter, 2%, right? So we have improved in the performance of agriculture, and when it comes to construction also, it has also grown, it has also done well. Services sector, relatively good, that's also doing well. So the culprits are only two, but the compensation has been made by the other three sectors to some extent. Next, the consumption expenditure. So to speak about the consumption expenditure, it is better we look at the GDP, how it is calculated. So GDP is generally calculated using three methods. One is the product method, the other one is the expenditure method, and the other one is income method. In India, we generally use the product method to calculate, and expenditure method is also used to calculate the GDP. So it is like cross verification we do, whether the numbers match or not. You have to get the same number using all the three methods. That's very important. So in the product method, all we do is, we are going to add the final value of all goods and services that are manufactured. In expenditure method, what we do is we add the expenditures that are done by various sectors in the sense, see here in product method, the sectors are going to be your agriculture, manufacturing, mining and quarrying, right, and services sector. In expenditure method, the sectors are going to be different. We are going to look at the sectors from a different perspective. We look at the sectors in terms of expenditure. It can be private final consumption expenditure, it can be your investment expenditure, and then it can be government final consumption expenditure, and add to it the exports and subtract the imports. This is known as net exports. So this is what we do with the expenditure method, and income method we don't use it much. So these are the two methods which are important. So from the expenditure side, if we look at it, the GDP numbers, what we observe is the private final consumption expenditure has grown. However, relatively it has dropped compared to the previous quarter or the previous year. So there is not much of consumption and expenditure that is being done. So automatically what will happen? This number would drop, overall GDP would drop. And next, the government final expenditure also dropped. So there was an increase, but not by much. Why was there a drop in the government final consumption expenditure? So there was this drop because of the model code of conduct. So there were elections held in various assemblies for state assemblies. Because of that, model code of conduct was there, where the government is not allowed to do excess spending, right? So in order to maintain that principle of equity, right? So the parties in power, the governments being run by political parties, they are not generally allowed to spend more. And now, when you look at the real GVA growth, this is the product method. So what we see is that the real GVA in the entire H1 was 6.2% growth. So in order to achieve 7% growth, we have to grow at a pace faster than 7% in the next 2 quarters. That's for sure. So we are talking about real GVA growth. When we speak about GVA, it is gross value added. So product method rests on this GVA method. So the product method is also called as GVA method. So the overall GVA has been good, but the GDP numbers are on the lower side, which is, which point to the fact that your GDP is equal to GVA plus taxes minus subsidies. What we are saying is that GVA has been stable. It means whatever GDP drop we are seeing, right? Whatever GDP drop we are seeing is probably because of the taxes and subsidies part. So overall, performance has been rather stable. So what is GVA? GVA is the measure of all the goods, value of all the final goods and services produced in the country. So to calculate GVA, you just have to subtract the taxes and add subsidies. So the same formula I just mentioned. So this is the graphical representation of it. So that's it for this video. Thank you for watching. So do subscribe for the channel. Thank you.